I'm Wendell Wallach, and I've been in the ethics and governance of emerging technologies, particularly AI, biotech, neurotechnologies, for 20-odd years now. So I go back when there were very few people in the world who even cared about these questions, let alone thought they were serious or they were requiring immediate attention. I'm perhaps best known for a book called Moral Machines: Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, which was the first book that looked at the prospects for developing computers and robots that were sensitive to ethical considerations and factored them into their choices and actions. I have a background that spans a vast array of different institutions and cultures, but I chaired technology and ethics at Yale for quite a few years, at least 11 years. I now am with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where I founded and co-direct an AI-Inequality initiative with Anya Kasperson. And my most recent work is focused on trying to think more deeply how we might take baby steps toward the international governance of artificial intelligence. Oh, and also one more thing to throw in. I had a book that was written a number of years ago called A Dangerous Master: How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. It was largely an introduction to the basic concepts that really inform all the discussions around transhumanism and artificial general intelligence and neuroscience and so forth. And it happens to be being republished as a paperback today. Today is its publication date, yes. So that sort of situates us to where we are so far. Well, the key ethical challenge, as far as I'm concerned, is how do you create AI that is truly sensitive to ethical considerations, recognizes them in real time, in context, and then what does it do with that ethical challenge once it's recognized? That how does it, if it is in a situation where it has to make a choice or take an action, then how does it process what action it should take? And though there's a lot of talk around AI alignment, I have seen very little, AI ethical alignment or values alignment. I've seen very little that convinces me that anybody's making any real headway on that. And interesting enough, there's been a lot of pushing aside a lot of the work done by philosophers and ethicists in this realm, which was under the framework of machine ethics or moral machines or other topics, but a lot of that's been pushed aside, and the technologists seem to be treating this as if they're the ones who are going to solve the problem. I don't think so. So in Moral Machines, again, this is a book that's 15 years old, but it's perhaps the most cited book when you think about ethics and computers. I think it has over 1,800 citations, which is very unusual for a book of that nature. We outlined 4 different questions that we thought framed the field of machine ethics. And one was, do you want machines to make ethical decisions? Another was, if so, then what will guide the decisions they make? So that's what is ethical. But as I said, another question was, is ethics tractable, computationally tractable? Can you implement it within a computational system? So we had 4 questions, of which the one of whose ethics or what ethics will guide the decision was only really one of those questions. And now we have, new battles about, I mean, it even came up in the conversations today. Is utilitarianism really, is that an approach that should be championed by people who are concerned with values in AI when it was presented as a de facto position by the chair of one of the sessions. Other people challenged it. There were other principles being talked about. Principles or rules or duties are usually, in the philosophical literature, those are deontological approaches. But interestingly enough, this group seemed to give no reference at all to the fact that there have been over 200 lists of principles that have been forged in the last 5 or 6 years. And most of them are very similar, but some of them, like those from the OECD or UNESCO, have vast bodies of countries that have endorsed them. So it was like a discussion about values, but somehow disassociated from the discussion about values for AI going on in the larger society. And I can appreciate that there might be questions in this community about how applicable those values are. But that should be a somewhat different discussion in my mind, which is, what is it about AGI that is not adequately being appreciated by the other lists of values that have been put forward, like fairness, accountability, transparency? And does this group have to reinvent a system of values for AGI, or can they build upon those principles that are already fairly well endorsed and just make some clarifications about other considerations that they don't think those principles adequately speak to? I mean, you know, think back to science fiction and Isaac Asimov. That's the first thing people think about when they think about ethical decision making by computers or robots or something like that. Asimov already got the problem that if machines became too intelligent, they were going to root out or find ways to work around their ethics. And his way of dealing with that was to make them integral to the positronic brain, which was his, you know, fanciful notion of what kind of computational systems we might have, and that it was so integral, it was like part of the operating system, so there was no way it could be rooted out without undermining the functioning of the system. Well, we don't have anything like that today. Nobody's even thinking about, you know, approaches like that, that at least some principles might actually be foundational, you know, like Asimov had don't harm humans. Well, there's almost universal respect for the golden rule or something like the golden rule. Nearly every culture has something like that. So that's just an example of a principle that could be made foundational as part of the operating system, or at least the core training set. Now, I'm not saying those are strategies that will or will not work, but I'm amazed how little I hear about that. Nearly every country has signed the International Declaration on Human Rights. So why isn't human rights just treated as foundational? So I think we're in this universe where there's not enough appreciation for what actually there's consensus on, too much focus on where there are differences, and an infatuation with the elements of artificial general intelligence that will make it different than everything else. And I agree, it will be different than everything else, but that doesn't mean it can't be inculcated with some foundational understanding of ethics, and that can't even be integrated into the very design of the system. So that's a profound question. And I'm going to step back, tell you a little bit more about who I am and what I'm doing right now. For 20-odd years, I have been a gadfly in the world of emerging technologies, meaning I tend to psych out where the problems are very early on, and I just start pointing, you know. And some people would argue that there's very little that I'm truly a professional in, but, you know, but I'm a transdisciplinary scholar who, you know, who's probably been one of the early people to underscore a vast array of concerns that require our attention. So generally what I have done is, once a bunch of people who are looking for a niche for themselves, because your whole generations, generation after generation, that's what we do. We want a niche that can support us, that we can do something interesting. Once a bunch of people move into a subject area that I might have been the first to underscore, I move on to what I think is the next thing that requires attention. So a few years ago, I was approached by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, and they said, we've been given a little bit of funding, and we think AI is a subject area, and we want you to lead our project, and what would you focus on? And I decided, in concert with this close colleague, Anya Kasperson, who's one of the more remarkable women in the world, that the topic we would have would be AI inequality. So the equality question is dear to our hearts. I actually initially wanted to call it AI and structural inequality, because a lot of what we have done has been underscoring how AI is exacerbating structural inequalities. So we're basically in a world right now where productivity gains go to basically those of us who have stocks. And people like me do not have very many stocks. I might have been smart enough to buy a few shares of NVIDIA, a couple of years ago. But those few shares, even with the 500% increase in those few years, aren't worth a great deal compared to, obviously, people who have massive quantities of shares in NVIDIA. So we are in this world, we are actually exacerbating inequality, productivity gains, which used to, about 50 years ago, there was roughly a 50% division between productivity gains going to basically wages and productivity gains going to the owners of capital. And now we're in a universe where 90% go to the owners of capital, and basically 90% of that goes to the top 1, 2, 3%. So, and AI is just going to exacerbate that. So AI is going to turn us into a situation where the AI oligopoly, the IT oligopoly has become the AI oligopoly, and they control more and more capital. So now the question is, how do you solve that? Well, you're going to have to do something radical. We need some form of capital distribution or redistribution if we are going to take care of larger shares of humanity, particularly if jobs get destroyed on a large-scale model. And the problem is, for every job that is automated, 100% of the productivity gains go to the owners of capital. They do not go to wages. They do not go to average citizens. So to me, this is perhaps the biggest problem we're confronting. And it's not only a problem, but my analysis of what we are dealing with in terms of political divisions in this same is, in some inchoate way, a large percentage of citizens are disquiet because they do not perceive that there's a future being created where there's any place for them and their children. So this becomes a major question. So we've talked about BGI, we've talked about others. I would actually like to see a number of things happen. I would like to see AI become a public utility. But that still requires the question of who manages it. But we're not going to be able to go down that road in this interview. But I would like to see AI be treated as a public utility and an international public utility, so that we have many more voices in how it is adopted to meet the needs of particular communities. So that would be one way we could move forward. Another issue that I happen to be really engaged in at this moment are questions around the democratization of AI and whether AI whether AI should be open source or whether AI should be controlled by the large corporations, and which poses more dangers for humanity. So I just happened to have done a podcast last week with one of the thought leaders, a woman, Elizabeth Seeger, who is very good on this question. She's also very good on understanding the different meanings of the democratization of AI. So I think that that is a critical question, but it's also a critical question. Well, if you leave it in the hands of the big corporations, which they want you to do, they're going to convince all of our lawmakers that it's much too complicated for the government to get involved in, and it's much too complicated to make open source, so trust them, and if you trust them, they will give you $500,000 toward your next campaign. So we are in a situation where I think we need a group of thought leaders coming together and brainstorming how we can keep AI open and minimize the misuses of it. So this is a fascinating event because it's brought together not just the AGI people, but it's brought together some people who have spiritual interests or humanistic spiritual interests. It's brought together transhumanists. And therefore, I see it as an event that in its own way is trying to build what it thinks would be the future culture and would be a healthy future culture. The challenge is whether or not this culture will be perceived as healthy and whether it will be the future culture and how it might be perceived by the outer world. And I think the challenge for this community is not to be too insular and get overly caught up in its beliefs that AGI is right around the corner or that transhumanism embodies the future, because you now, for example, have a conservative elite who is pointing specifically to exactly some of the things that this community is trying to build upon to create a future culture, a beneficial future culture, as being the devil. So I think it's fascinating to see the seeds of creating this as a community. I saw the seeds way back in 2001 at the World Transhumanist Conference that had many of the same people. Well, there's at least a few people here who were there, and many of the same beliefs. And the reality is they thought that all of this was going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And here we are another 24 years or 23 years down the road. So I've been around long enough to understand that that all of this isn't happening, isn't going to necessarily happen immediately. It may take much longer, and there's certain questions that have not been answered, such as the ethical questions that we have already been talked about. I think consciousness is much more problematic than people who want to see emergent consciousness coming out of large language models, for example. But I think here's my call to action, okay? I think we've spent too much time each preaching to each other what our project is and why they should be on our project. And we need much more brainstorming together to really unpack and see whether we have viable courses ahead to ensure that AI is ethical, that it won't be harmful, viable approaches to decentralization. So I don't see that happening yet. That's a little bit what I've been trying to do in areas of governance, bring together thought leaders and have them brainstorm together. And it's my belief that intelligence is not the property of any individual. It's not the property of any machine. Intelligence is collective. It's embodied in culture. And the failure of human beings has been working together on complex problems. And that's the skill we have to cultivate. And as we cultivate that skill, there will be room at the table for AI. There will be room at the table for perhaps transhuman individuals who are exhibiting exceptional intelligence in some area. And if they are not sophisticated enough, they will speak through what shall I say, the transdisciplinary leaders, the experienced leaders who are sitting at the table, leaders who are willing to sacrifice their own benefits for the good of humanity.